everybody. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Doing something a bit different in this episode. This is the beginning of a new series within the Catholic Culture Podcast that I will be doing on the magisterium of Pope Leo XIII. There's obviously a heightened interest in Leo XIII right now because of our new Pope, Leo XIV, taking that name, explicitly citing the social teaching of Leo XIII as an influence on him, and particularly Rerum Novarum, his most famous encyclical. And so I've been wanting to dive into more of the encyclicals of Leo XIII for a while now. I've read a few of them, but by no means all of the most important ones. And I thought I would take the opportunity to dive in and invite all of you along with me to learn more about this Pope who was so foundational for Catholic social teaching. Although not only that, he wrote on many other things. Famously wrote, something like 11 encyclicals on the Rosary, for instance. Why he was called the Rosary Pope. So I want to take advantage of this renewal of interest in Leo XIII to give myself a deeper familiarity with his teachings. And also, in particular, I've been wanting to draw attention to the kind of organic unity of Catholic social doctrine. So when people think about Catholic social teaching, they're often thinking about teachings on economic justice, but it's really so much more than that. And in particular, you can't understand Leo XIII's teachings in an encyclical like Rerum Novarum outside of the context of his teachings elsewhere, say on marriage, the structure of the family, the rights of the family, as well as his teachings on the true meaning of liberty and the relationship between the church and the state. And well, there's been throughout the over a century since Leo's pontificate, there's been a pretty consistent interest on the part of Catholics and church leadership in the economic aspects and perhaps even the sort of more immediate moral aspects more generally of Catholic social teaching. But in the past several decades since Vatican II, certain things have been kind of neglected. One of those being the traditional teaching on relations between church and state, the traditional doctrine on religious liberty or freedom of speech, the hierarchical structure of marriage. Now, I'm not saying that later, more recent teachings of popes or Vatican II are contrary to the traditional doctrine. I'm definitely not saying that, but certain things have been less emphasized. And so I think it's really helpful to read a number of encyclicals by Leo XIII and see that these things all kind of go together. The Church's teaching on marriage is a social doctrine. The family is the fundamental unit of society, so it's social doctrine. The Church's teaching on relationship between church and state, that's all social doctrine and was understood as such by Leo XIII, although I guess he didn't use that phrase. I think, if I remember correctly, maybe it was the Pius XI who first used that phrase, Catholic social teaching. Could be wrong about that. On a personal level, Leo's thought, particularly in the encyclicals Rerum Novarum and Immortale Dei, the latter of which is on church and state, have really influenced the way I think about the social order and help me to get even further away, for example, from my early libertarian phase, things like that. But they've just profoundly influenced how I think about politics, and I'm satisfied with saying I'm Catholic when it comes to my political views. But if I were to specify that, I'd probably say Leonine, not to neglect later Catholic social teachings of subsequent popes, but to say that I'm Leonine, it means that those teachings have particularly formed how I think about these things. Leo XIII was born in 1810. He became pope in 1878, I think so. Yeah, he would have been about 68, and that's very similar to our present Pope Leo, who was elected at 69, and he died in 1903. He had quite a long pontificate. I think the third longest pontificate, or maybe the fourth longest. I forget. So he had a lot of time to write, and he wrote a ton. He wrote 88 encyclicals. This is early in what's been called the encyclical era, because popes were not always nearly so prolific, certainly in this genre of letters addressed to the whole church, usually to the bishops of the church, to give a kind of a systematic exposition of some doctrinal point. He wrote 88 of them, and he never wrote any treatise, scholarly work, before becoming pope. But so he started his life as a public intellectual, you might say, when he was almost 70. This is a point made by the great scholar of Catholic social teaching, Russell Hittinger. Now, of course, he had help. He wasn't drafting all these things by himself. I'm not going to be discussing all 88 of his encyclicals. I'm going to be discussing, I would guess, at least 20, maybe closer to 30 of them. I'm following this 2-volume set published by Cluny Media, Pope Leo XIII, The Great Encyclicals. Volume 1, the social letters. Volume 2, the spiritual letters. I'm not necessarily following the order that they include them in, nor am I following exactly the division between social and spiritual letters, because some of the things, at the very least, the encyclical on marriage is included in the spiritual letters, and I think it would have been more appropriately included in the social letters to highlight, again, this organic unity of Catholic social teaching, and his teaching on marriage is pretty fundamental in that. In terms of the order I'll be following, I'm not quite sure totally what the order will be, but something that's informing my choice, certainly the one I begin with today, is a list of 9 encyclicals that Pope Leo himself made in a document late in his pontificate. I think it was part of a document celebrating the 25th anniversary of his pontificate. And there's an old collection of Leo's major encyclicals with an introduction by Etienne Gilson. And Gilson mentions this, and he thought that this list of 9 particularly important Leo 9 encyclicals made by Leo himself was indicating to us not only the importance of these particular ones, but also perhaps the order in which they should be considered, the logical order rather than a chronological order. Now, as for the format of this series, it's mostly going to be just me talking about these encyclicals. I definitely hope to have Russell Hittinger on for a more general interview about Leo's contribution. And maybe I'll get some guests on to discuss some of these encyclicals. Part of the reason I wanted to be a consistent personnel speaking here, namely myself, partly because I don't want to just sort of have a discussion of one encyclical isolated from his broader corpus with a person who hasn't read a larger number of them. And so I'm trying to, I want to be reading and discussing these in context. Now, the first one, the one I'm going to be discussing today, and this is the first on Leo's own list of his important encyclicals, is Aeterni Patris, on the restoration of Christian philosophy. And as the title indicates, you could imagine this is sort of foundational. You know, this is before getting into social issues or other theological issues that he might discuss. This restoration of Christian philosophy supplies some, maybe not principles, but sort of meta principles for how Christian intellectual life should be pursued. This is his third encyclical, too. It was published in 1879, 18 months into his pontificate. It was initially drafted by Cardinal Tommaso Maria Ziliara, OP, as well as Matteo Liberatore. And this was the encyclical that famously called for a revival of the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. Just a couple of months later, that same year, Leo established the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, and he made his brother, a scholar named Giuseppe Pecci, its first rector. So he not only wrote this thing on the revival of Thomistic thought, he also created institutions to further that goal, and hired people that he knew and trusted, and some other people who had influenced his own thinking to spearhead this Thomistic revival. Just a little bit more context, and I don't know how much I'll be going into a lot of historical context in all of these episodes, because I really want to focus on the teachings, on the texts. Nor am I an expert on, 19th century Catholic political history or anything like that. That's one of the reasons I want to have Russell Hittinger on, because he knows a lot about that kind of stuff. But a bit of context for this, basically that Catholic engagement in philosophy, at least since the 18th century or so, maybe even since the 16th century, Leo mentions that in his encyclical, Catholic engagement philosophy had become kind of a mess, kind of haphazard, piecemeal, eclectic, and apparently, and I'm getting this from Russell Hittinger, who has a collection of essays recently out from Catholic University of America Press titled On the Dignity of Society. It's about Catholic social teaching and natural law, and he's got a number of essays dealing with the contribution of Leo XIII. Anyway, as he describes it, Catholic philosophy was kind of taking bits and pieces from various modern philosophers, Descartes, Kant, Hegel, taking bits and pieces from them and kind of trying to turn them to a Catholic purpose. But there wasn't any kind of systematic approach anymore, such as had been found among the scholastics. Of course, there were different schools, but there was kind of a more unified body of work that people were drawing from in terms of their philosophical approaches. And so there was a lot of following the fads of the time, and again, trying to kind of create a Catholic version of that at best. And so that's the context in which he's writing Aeterni Patris on the restoration of Christian philosophy. So I'm going to go right into it, and I'll be summarizing a lot of it, but I will read a few extended passages. And the first one I want to read is in paragraph 2. A fruitful cause of the evils which now afflict, as well as those which threaten us, lies in this, that false conclusions concerning divine and human things, which originated in the schools of philosophy, have now crept into all the orders of the state, and have been accepted by the common consent of the masses. So you see a social concern even here in this encyclical on philosophy. Going on, for since it is in the very nature of man to follow the guide of reason in his actions, and if his intellect sins at all, his will soon follows. And thus it happens that false opinions, whose seat is in the understanding, influence human actions and pervert them. Whereas, on the other hand, if men be of sound mind and take their stand on true and solid principles, there will result a vast amount of benefits for the public and private good. And I think this paragraph is interesting, mainly because of this principle that he gives, since it's in the very nature of man to follow the guide of reason in his actions. So right here, and this is going to happen a few times in this encyclical, without naming this as a Thomistic principle, he is giving a Thomistic principle here, the primacy of the intellect over the will. Meaning, the will chooses what the intellect perceives as good. The will is bound to choose something that's perceived by the intellect as good. The will is not indifferent to truth. It's not sort of free-floating. It's not purely arbitrary. This is contrary to what's called voluntarism. And so I thought it was interesting that he has that Thomistic principle embedded right at the very beginning, in even analyzing what has happened. Yes, it's possible to overstate the importance of the intellect in social trends, because sometimes people just have a corrupt will. They know what's right and they choose not to do it. That actually happens all the time. But still, it's always following a misperception of truth, what the intellect perceives as true. So it's highly consequential. People who might be skeptical of how important is philosophy really, while these things trickle down. They trickle down from the intellectual class to government policy, into the universities, into lower levels of schooling, the media. They influence people. Leo's pointing this out. He goes on to note, of course, grace and revelation is most important in our pursuit of truth, but the light of reason is a gift from God, and it's strengthened by faith, but not obliterated by it. And he goes on, there's a bit of historical material in this encyclical. He points out the fathers of the church made use of reason. And they made this analogy, you've probably heard this before, for the Christian use of philosophy that was initially developed by pagans. They likened it to the Hebrews in the book of Exodus, plundering the treasures of Egypt. There was another patristic analogy he mentions, snatching away a weapon from one's enemy to use it against him. And that's obviously in a more apologetic context. So he says that philosophy, when it's rightly used, prepares the way for faith. There's some revealed truths that are only knowable through revelation. Others can be found by reason. And some of these latter truths, which can be discovered by reason, were, in fact, discovered by pagan philosophers. The existence of God, his infinite perfection, and that he is not only the source of truth, but that he is truth itself. And Leo mentioned these particular truths that the pagans were able to discover by reason, not just as arbitrary examples, but precisely because these things discoverable by reason are motives for trusting divine revelation. And he also mentions that reason can detect the signs of truth of the gospel and the signs that the church is divinely instituted, even though it can't prove things that are matters of supernatural faith only. Now, he goes a bit further here that philosophy is not merely useful, but there's also a service which is required of it by sacred theology to, quote, receive and assume the nature, form, and genius of a true science. For in this, the most noble of studies, it is of the greatest necessity to bind together, as it were, in one body, the many and various parts of the heavenly doctrines, so that each being allotted to its own proper place and derived from its own proper principles, the whole may join together in a complete union, in order, in fine, that all and each part may be strengthened by its own and the other's invincible arguments. So the application of reason is not just to give us the preambles of faith. It also can give us a better understanding of the revealed truths themselves. Not a perfect understanding, but it can give us a better understanding of them. And particularly, he highlights how these truths are all related in a harmonious whole. And this is the task of systematic theology, which pretty much necessarily requires philosophy. Especially if you understand that philosophy, in this sense, is reason. It's just the use of reason. So anybody who kind of claims to be against philosophy, in doctrine, I should say, and thinks that it's a distraction from revealed truth is kind of saying that implicitly, I think, that we should just accept without making any attempt to understand it, because we necessarily use our reason in some way to try to understand and more deeply enter into revelation. So to an extent, he is using philosophy as synonymous with reason here. He goes on to say, the knowledge of such sacred dogmas ought to be sought as well from analogy of the things that are naturally known, as from the connection of those mysteries one with another and with the final end of man. So not only does reason allow us to understand the interconnection between various sacred dogmas and doctrines, it also allows us to connect them with natural things and to understand those supernatural things better by analogy. There's also the apologetic function of philosophy, to be able to defend the faith against spurious attacks. The enemies of the faith use philosophical arguments against it. Okay, we're going to refute them on their own ground. He points out St. Paul used this strategy in Athens at his speech at the Areopagus. And it was expressed early in the church's history. He says that the truth is one, and therefore faith and reason are fully compatible. They're never contradictory. He also points out that philosophy stays safe from error by submitting to revelation, so that philosophers should not be afraid that submitting to revelation is going to stifle them in their quest for truth. If they really have a disinterested quest for truth going on, then the faith not only keeps it safe, it actually enhances reason. So it's not just a matter of avoiding error, but we can even get further in our use of pure natural reason when the light of faith is shining on it. But in practice, one reason that various people throughout history, schools of thought, have pushed back against the use of philosophy by theologians, especially the use of philosophy deriving from a pagan thinker like Aristotle or Plato. One reason that they've objected to that is this has gone wrong on various occasions. It went wrong with Origen, for instance. It's gone wrong with, the list of people who have relied too much on their own reason, and then or the influence of non-Catholic thinkers, and failed to synthesize that correctly and leave what was false behind and only retain what was true. It's a long list of people. So Leo says, as it is evident that very many truths of the supernatural order, which are far beyond the reach of the keenest intellect, must be accepted, human reason, conscious of its own infirmity, dare not affect to itself too great powers, nor deny those truths, nor measure them by its own standard, nor interpret them at will, but receive them rather with a full and humble faith, and esteem it the highest honor to be allowed to wait upon heavenly doctrines like a handmaid and attendant, and by God's goodness attain to them in any way whatsoever. So in order to safely make use of philosophy and apply them to revealed truth, first of all, it requires humility. Humility about one's own intellect. Maybe you could say a kind of a civilizational humility. Okay, we have these great philosophers in our pedigree, but there's something that comes from outside. Let's say the Greeks had to accept this. The Greeks who converted to Christ, that our rational achievements in our civilization, our great philosophers, are not sufficient. They need to wait upon heavenly doctrines like a handmaid and an attendant. And for the loftiest exercise of the human intellect, that is a real mortification. I'm a handmaid and attendant to something higher. I also note that you observe this today, certainly, with academic theology. Some people treat the teachings of the faith as just something on which to exercise their intellectual powers. It's almost like a game. And so they are kind of looking for things that tickle their ears, tickle their intellect, and kind of exercising it for its own sake, not resting in the truth, resting in what's passed down. A too eager striving for originality, for instance, rather than simply accepting what's been passed down. That the real originality comes from, by the way, is not intellectual. It comes from the quote unquote synthesis you make in your own life through seeking holiness. That's the originality you want. It's actually coming from deep within your soul because you have actually lived by the truth. And that will always be unique and unrepeatable. And then, that will come out if you're a philosopher or a theologian, that will come out. But if you're simply kind of seeking originality, intellectual originality for its own sake, then there's a lack of humility in that, because the attention is on you rather than on the truth. But qualifying this, he says, in the case of such doctrines as the human intelligence may perceive, it is equally just that philosophy should make use of its own method, principles, and arguments. So over the next several paragraphs, starting in paragraph 10, Leo XIII traces the history of philosophy in the church. He's giving evidence of this role that philosophy has had since the earliest centuries. Before that, he notes that the pre-Christian philosophers, because of their lack of faith, fell into this multitude of conflicting doctrines. This is something the early fathers pointed out. They fell into this multitude of conflicting doctrines on the most fundamental questions about God, about man, about the universe, because they lacked this stabilizing force of faith. And with the best of intentions, they didn't all agree with each other, let's put it that way. But the early fathers and doctors understood that, in Leo's words, the restorer of human science is Christ, who is the power and wisdom of God. Because they had this rooting in Christ, they could discern what was good, what was bad in pagan literature. he goes through a list of important figures and important exemplars of the use of philosophy by faith. St. Justin Martyr, the early apologists. St. Justin Martyr, Quadratus, Aristides, Hermias, Athenagoras, some of these lesser-known apologists of the second century, maybe the 3rd century too. Clement of Alexandria, Origen, although he notes Origen fell into errors, so there's a cautionary tale there as well. He ended up being condemned by an ecumenical council for that reason. Tertullian, I think it's ironic that he mentions Tertullian because Tertullian has, the famous quote, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" He questioned the relevance of pagan philosophy to Christians. But again, as I said, if you're using reason, really, as Tertullian certainly did, he was no slouch in using reason. If you're using reason, you're implicitly using philosophy in the faith. Whether that philosophy has a pagan pedigree is in a sense irrelevant, because as St. Justin so brilliantly pointed out, all truth belongs to Christians. It's the inheritance of Christians. All truth comes from God. Mentions Arnobius, Lactantius, St. Athanasius, St. John Chrysostom, the Cappadocian Fathers, St. Basil the Great, St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Gregory of Nazianzus. Later on, St. John of Damascus in the east, St. Boethius, St. Anselm of Canterbury in the west. But he concludes this saying, "But Augustine would seem to have wrested the palm from all." Augustine has the prime place among the fathers, at least as far as his use of philosophy in the service of revealed truth is concerned. So then Leo goes on, the scholastic doctors of the Middle Ages, so we're getting more proximate to the main focus of Leo's encyclical here. The scholastics, they collected and they synthesized the writings of the fathers. Leo quotes at length Pope Sixtus V, praising in particular St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Bonaventure. Sixtus praises scholastic theology for its orderliness, its distinction-making, its clarity, its ability to unmask the fallacies of the enemies of the faith. And Leo says that this applies not only to scholastic theology, but to philosophy as well, because the scholastics used that in their theological disputations. And I like this line from Leo. "It is the proper and special office of the scholastic theologians to bind together by the fastest chain human and divine science." It almost makes me think of the hypostatic union, binding together by the fastest chain humanity and divinity. Well, the scholastic theologians imitate that by binding together by the fastest chain human and divine science. Hey, the logic of the incarnation is inevitable. You could say the history of the church is just a progressive unfolding of the logic of the incarnation, in a sense. It was inevitable, if you follow that logic, that human reason be brought to this apex in the work of the scholastic theologians. So just in the same way as he ranked St. Augustine as the greatest of the fathers in terms of their use of philosophy to serve the faith, Leo ranks St. Thomas Aquinas, surprise, surprise, as the greatest of the scholastic doctors. And in his praise of St. Thomas, I think this is the most significant passage. Leo says, "The angelic doctor pushed his philosophic inquiry into the reasons and principles of things, which, because they are most comprehensive and contain in their bosom, so to say, the seeds of almost infinite truths, were to be unfolded in good time by later masters and with a goodly yield." And as he also used this philosophic method in the refutation of error, he won this title to distinction for himself. That single-handed, he victoriously combated the errors of former times and supplied invincible arms to put those to rout which might in after times spring up. Again, clearly distinguishing, as it is fitting, reason from faith, while happily associating the one with the other, he both preserved the rights and had regard for the dignity of each, so much so, indeed, that reason, borne on the wings of Thomas to its human height, can scarcely rise higher, while faith could scarce expect more or stronger aids from reason than those which she has already obtained through Thomas. In particular, I want to focus on what he says about the reasons and principles of things that can be unfolded by later masters and supply these invincible arms to put to rout heresies that hadn't even come into being yet. That's how fecund Thomistic philosophy is. And this is why the Thomistic revival is so crucial for Leo XIII, because Thomas's principles are able to be applied in fresh ways to new problems in theology, in science, and in social life. And it is true. I mean, the 20th century, you see this amazing Thomistic revival following Leo and Pius X. You know, the Thomistic thinker, modern Thomistic thinker I'm most familiar with is Jacques Maritain. You know, people will criticize him for his political thought. Fine. I'm very familiar with his writings on art, and he applied scholastic and Thomistic thought to art like nobody else had in his book Art and Scholasticism and other works. And so, again, it's endlessly fresh. People like Maritain made a great case for the continuing relevance of Thomism. You know, it's beautiful because Leo XIII asserted that this is going to be continually relevant. And more things are going to be derived from these essential principles of St. Thomas. He was proved right within decades by all these brilliant Thomistic thinkers, different waves of the ongoing, still today, Thomistic revival. Leo talks about the respect St. Thomas has been shown throughout the ages. In particular, I thought it was interesting. He notes that most of the founders and legislators of religious orders had required their members to study and adhere to the teachings of St. Thomas. He mentions the Dominicans, the Benedictines, the Carmelites, the Augustinians, the Jesuits, and others. He also lists the tribute many previous popes had given to St. Thomas Aquinas, and a number of them proposed St. Thomas as a model for the great universities. In particular, he quotes Innocent VI, 14th century pope. Innocent wrote, "His teaching, St. Thomas's teaching above that of others, the canonical writings alone accepted," meaning scripture alone accepted, "enjoys such a precision of language, an order of matters, a truth of conclusions, that those who hold to it are never found in swerving from the path of truth, and he who dare assail it will always be suspected of error." That's a great quote. And there's other quotes from popes to this effect, that those who attack St. Thomas are suspect. And I've noticed, even just on, to be trivial, online, you notice that certain modernist or modernist-leaning Catholics have a particular resentment for St. Thomas. They might not say St. Thomas. Some of them will just say they don't like Thomists. Some of them will say they don't like Dominicans. Some people, Mike Lewis of the website Where Peter Is, has repeatedly expressed his resentment of the Eastern Province Dominicans in particular. And the reason for that, frankly, is because of the rigor and the clarity that Thomists bring to things. You can't get away with anything with St. Thomas. They're going to make distinctions. You're not going to be getting away with a good Thomistic philosopher or theologian. You're not going to get away with it. You're not going to get away with equivocations. They're sticklers, and they're going to stickle you, so to speak. So the resentment of St. Thomas or Thomists, Dominicans, whatever. Not to say Thomists have never, made mistakes, been uncharitable, been uptight, been overly dry, whatever. You can find instances of all those stereotypes for sure. But I think the resentment for Thomists and Dominican Thomists is kind of like the resentment of the thief towards the security guard in the store. They're trying to get away with something, and they can't. They can't. So it must be very frustrating, I'm sure, if you're trying to be a bit sloppy and somebody doesn't let you. I can sympathize with that frustration. Hey, who doesn't want to be sloppy in their reasoning from time to time? He also mentions multiple councils were influenced by St. Thomas's teaching, and this is just awesome. I did not know this. But the chief and special glory of Thomas, one which he has shared with none of the Catholic doctors, is that the Fathers of Trent made it part of the order of the conclave to lay upon the altar, together with sacred scripture and the decrees of the supreme pontiffs, the Summa of Thomas Aquinas, whence to seek counsel, reason, and inspiration. Wow, that is amazing. What a profound honor. The same altar on which the holy sacrifice of the Eucharist, which St. Thomas explained and defended so well. So what a profound honor. Anyway, not to harp on that too much. So Leo concludes, special honor should always be given to scholastic philosophy, and particularly that of the angelic doctor. And here's where, at this point, I already mentioned this sort of chaotic, haphazard, messy state that Catholic use of philosophy had been in leading up to St. Leo's time. At this point, he talks about that. And basically, what it comes down to is this kind of eclectic philosophy drawing from modern philosophers. Not that you can't draw from modern philosophers, but doing it in a way that's kind of not coherent, not really holding together. It's not a robust or a stable, perennial philosophy that can be applied to new problems. It's very much of its time. It becomes dated. It's kind of this eclectic patchwork. You know, the analogy of a mule occurs to me. A mule, a mix between a donkey and a horse. Mules are sterile; they can't reproduce, and likewise, these eclectic philosophies, you have to be able to integrate them into a unified whole. That's basically the problem. And St. Thomas's philosophy, it's been observed by many thinkers, is far more able to integrate the best insights of other philosophers who may disagree with him on many things, like the philosophers of his time, Avicenna, Maimonides, the ancient Greeks. His philosophy is strong and stable and capacious enough to absorb those great insights without losing its integrity. Aquinas, it's like a microcosm of the genius of the West, of Christendom specifically, this ability to take in influences while retaining its identity. Now, in paragraphs 28 and 29, he introduces the importance of St. Thomas to a doctrine of civil society. And he mentions St. Thomas's teachings, quote, on the true meaning of liberty, which at this time is running into license, on the divine origin of all authority, on laws and their force, on the paternal and just rule of princes, on obedience to the higher powers, on mutual charity toward one another, on all of these and kindred subjects, have very great and invincible force to overturn those principles of the new order which are well known to be dangerous to the peaceful order of things and to public safety. So this is where he brings in part of his motivation for seeking a Thomistic revival is a lot of the chaos in Leo's time and just before it, certainly during the time of his predecessor, Pius IX, was civil chaos, revolutions, new doctrines of the state, of the relationship between the state and the church, the state and the family. And this is where I want to take a tangent, because this is where Russell Hittinger's work has been helpful to me. Again, his new collection on the dignity of society, Catholic social teaching and natural law, contains an essay, Two Modernisms, Two Thomisms. And it's responding to, it's about Leo XIII's response to political civic modernism and Pius X's responding to theological modernism. So Leo's encyclical and his whole pontificate is coming in the context of this beginning of a use of St. Thomas to develop a civil doctrine. And according to Hittinger, this term civil doctrine had already been used. Social doctrine wasn't a term until a little bit later. It was civil doctrine that people talked about. People were trying to use St. Thomas to develop a civil doctrine in response to the political crises of the 19th century. And the Jesuit-run journal, La Civiltà Cattolica, now, like many Jesuit institutions, not so great. But it was founded in 1850 in part to do this. And you had figures like Luigi Tapparelli and Matteo Liberatore, again, the latter of whom was one of the drafters of this encyclical. And Leo also made him a member of the Roman Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. So they were working on this. They were big influences on Leo and his magisterium. And Hittinger observes that most of the references to St. Thomas in Leo's magisterium are actually in a socio-political context. So that is kind of the prime concern, seemingly, in his call for a Thomistic revival. Well, when it comes to theology, in a sense, there's kind of only one right answer. There's many, many ways to answer, but they all kind of have to lead you to one right answer. To theological questions, political questions, politics is an art, Politics is made by human beings. It's natural to us. Political authority is instituted by God, but the particular form that takes is a human invention. And so there's a lot more freedom to implement St. Thomas's thought in a wide variety of ways And so Leo was not laying out a single rigid interpretation of how Thomas's thought should be applied to political theory or present-day political conditions. And as a matter of fact, popes and Catholic thinkers throughout the next century after Leo were able to develop a variety of applications of Thomism to the political realm. And they to use Hittinger's phrase, they engaged creatively with modern regimes, which is something that the church had really struggled to do leading up to Leo's point. Catholic thinkers, the church tended to be very resistant to democracy for a lot of understandable reasons. But Leo found that it was necessary at this point to engage creatively with these regimes instead. And I want to read this passage from Hittinger, which is very informative. And this is not only with regard to this encyclical, but Leo's wider promotion of the Thomistic revival. Hittinger says, quote, Leo gave his Thomists permission to do 4 things. First, to resurrect the doctrine of plural legitimate forms of regimes. This was the sore spot of the Baroque tradition, and he's saying that because the early modern Catholic monarchies tended to be Catholic absolute monarchies, and so would have been very hostile to any kind of discussion of other possible political regimes. And in Leo's time, it was still a neuralgic issue for the remnants of the Catholic right wing, especially in France. So there were these kind of radical reactionary Catholic right-wing figures responding to the French Revolution with a call for monarchy. Obviously, I'm very sympathetic to monarchy, but Leo was saying, nonetheless, there are plural legitimate forms of regimes. Second, Hittinger says, he gave them permission to speculatively re-engage the so-called translation theory of authority, according to which God, by the natural law, vests authority originally, though inchoately, in the body politic. This means that God bestows authority on rulers through the consent of the people. This was a controversial idea. This, Hittinger says, seemed to be a promising way to give a scholastic foundation to political consent. Very, very popular idea for modernity, the consent of the governed, and brought the Thomistic tradition to the vestibule of democratic theory. Third, he gave them permission to integrate natural law and natural rights. Fourth, to allow analysis of historical change to play a role in the prudence of state-making. And this would all be, again, in a time of great political change, which really has not ceased to occur throughout the 20th century. This is crucial in giving Catholic thinkers the flexibility and the church the flexibility to respond to the world as it is, not to endorse everything that's happening in modernity, but to respond to real social conditions. You can't do that. You can be pro-monarchy. I am, but we don't live in a monarchy, so we have to be able to respond to things as they are. To an extent, a lot of Catholic political thinkers were having trouble doing that, or insofar as they were, perhaps they were falling into modern philosophical errors. Thomism has the strength of its principles to prevent error, and the robustness and the flexibility of its principles to allow a variety of applications, not to beat that horse too much. Leo goes on to mention Aquinas' principles will benefit all the arts and the physical sciences too. And particularly, he says this because St. Thomas held that human beings only come to knowledge through sensible things. And so Thomistic philosophy, as well as Aristotelian philosophy, is inherently very friendly to empirical science. And a final point from Leo. Leo clarifies that he's not just recommending an indiscriminate return to just any form of scholasticism. So I'll quote him here. The wisdom of St. Thomas, we say, for if anything is taken up with too great subtlety by the scholastic doctors, or too carelessly stated, if there be anything that ill agrees with the discoveries of a later age, or, in a word, improbable in any way, it does not enter our mind to propose that for imitation to our age. Let carefully selected teachers endeavor to implant the doctrine of St. Thomas Aquinas in the minds of students and set forth clearly his solidity and excellence over others. So he is recommending scholasticism, but particularly the wisdom of St. Thomas, because the scholastic doctors could fall into errors, or even sometimes, if not errors, just sort of fruitless distinction mongering, something that sort of went out of control in nominalist, post-Occam scholastic philosophy, leading to sort of the double reactions of Renaissance humanism and also the Protestant Reformation against scholasticism. And Leo also warns against schools of thought that falsely claim to be Thomistic. So he recommends going either directly to St. Thomas or to theologians who have a good reputation as his faithful followers. And finally, Pope Leo XIII recommends imitating St. Thomas in another respect too, because he says that St. Thomas never gave himself to reading or writing without first begging the blessing of God, and that he modestly confessed that whatever he knew he had acquired not so much by his own study and labor as by the divine gift. I'm actually reading this wonderful biography of St. Thomas by William of Tocco, who knew him personally. It's been recently translated. And it's so edifying, and it makes that abundantly clear. St. Thomas really did give credit for his discoveries to God. He prayed assiduously with tears for insight. And it says the same thing about St. Albert. There's a story about St. Albert telling someone that the reason he was so brilliant in so many different areas was basically he had a vision from Mary, who personally gave him like an intellectual system upgrade. So he got this brilliance miraculously from God, not only through his natural gifts. Now, this is a really cool encyclical, but one of the things that strikes me actually is, for me, how little of it was new for me. I think we take a lot of this stuff about the importance of philosophy to theology for granted today. If you're a decently formed Catholic, anybody with a decent Catholic high school education, or anybody who follows, Bishop Barron or whatever, would be familiar with this idea of the unity of faith and reason, the unity of truth, the historical importance of philosophy in the Catholic development of theology. By Leo's time, this value of philosophy for theology had become somewhat obscured because philosophy just wasn't being used that well. Now seminarians, I don't know what it was like at the time, but now seminarians have to get a 4-year degree in philosophy to become priests. So that is kind of taken for granted in a sense. And also now we've benefited in our time from at least like 3 or 4 different Thomistic revivals. The one instigated by Leo, the one instigated by Pius X, the pre-conciliar one, following on both of those with philosophers like Jacques Maritain. And now there's an ongoing post-conciliar Thomistic revival, just going from strength to strength, really, again, to a large extent due to, the Eastern Province Dominicans. John Paul II promoted St. Thomas, people like Bishop Barron. And one of the good things about this current Thomistic revival is it's been successful enough that people are starting to get interested in scholasticism more generally outside of Thomism. And we're seeing alongside the Thomistic revival a greater interest in the Franciscan theological tradition, going back to Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, etc. In fact, in a recent interview I did with a philosopher about Peter Lombard's sentences, he mentioned that after Aeterni Patris came out, there was immediately this project begun of preparing the critical edition of the works of St. Bonaventure. So they were sort of concerned, not going against Leo's call for focus on Thomas Aquinas, but sort of they wanted to make sure that the works of St. Bonaventure were not forgotten amidst this sort of flood of Thomism. Sometimes people can be a bit rigid about this, as though St. Thomas, his philosophy, his theology, these are the only valid philosophy and theology for Catholics. No. Thomas, clearly, the magisterium has continued to give him this pride of place in education, seminary education, things like that. That's not to say that you can't be focused on other things. Benedict XVI, it's well known that he did not consider himself a Thomist. He was more interested in St. Bonaventure. Bonaventure is a doctor of the church. He was not a Thomist, and so there's room for a big tent of Catholic theology, multiple schools, perhaps a holy rivalry, not a sinful, envious, or ambitious rivalry, but seeking the truth, seeking the holiness in various ways, various angles on reality, because the human mind is finite. And, as many human minds as there are, as many perspectives on reality there are. But, clearly the church has privileged St. Thomas. Nobody else had their books put on the altar at the Council of Trent. I don't know what to tell you guys. You gotta give it to St. Thomas on that level. It's not exclusively, the church is not exclusively Thomistic, never has been, never will be. But he has this important central place in the teaching, the exposition of the faith, and has been just unbelievably fruitful in Catholic social thought, which is where we're going in subsequent episodes. The next in this series will be a little bit more spicy in its subject matter, because we are going to be discussing Libertas, his encyclical Libertas. Who'd have thought the Catholic Church has a different view of liberty than modern Enlightenment liberalism does? So I'm really looking forward to getting into that in this series. And of course, my normal interviews and things will continue alongside this, but we've got plenty of time. Hopefully a long pontificate of Pope Leo XIV. I'm hoping this Leo IX revival, at the same time of the previous Leo's thought, will pick up steam. By the way, along with each of these episodes, I'm going to write an article on, the given encyclical. So you can check those out at catholicculture.org. Everything, I write all kinds of stuff that doesn't appear in the podcast or the YouTube channel. And we got all sorts of stuff going on there. So if you'd like to keep tabs on what we're doing at Catholic Culture, I do encourage you, go to catholicculture.org/newsletter. Sign up for an email newsletter. Keep apprised. Everybody, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of catholicculture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at catholicculture.org.